The next item of business is topical questions, and at question number 1, I call Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that the former Chief Executive of CalMac received a severance package exceeding £170,000, including whether this complied with the severance provisions set out in the Scottish Public Finance Manual.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
CalMac has confirmed in response to these press reports that its former CEO did not receive a severance package of £170,000. They confirmed that payments consisted of salary and pension payments to which the CEO was entitled, in addition to payments for compensation for loss of office. At the time the settlement agreement was proposed, CalMac initially indicated the settlement agreement would be £95,000, in line with the requirements of the Scottish Public Finance Manual. We have recently been advised by CalMac that this figure did not include accrued holiday pay as it should have, and payment for this was subsequently added. In including these, the final payment that reflected compensation settlement was £107,635, and therefore above the threshold where they should seek ministerial approval. Given the level of settlement, this decision should have come to ministers, and I therefore find this position to be entirely unsatisfactory. The Permanent Secretary has undertaken to look further into the circumstances around the settlement, and officials have now written to the CalMac CEO and Chair, reminding him of the need to comply with the Scottish Public Finance Manual and seeking a full and detailed explanation as to why due process was not followed in this case.
Jamie Green.
I have to say I'm glad I asked, because it's difficult to see whether any of this would ever come to the public light. The Scottish Public Finance Manual is abundantly clear on what the process is around severance packages. Any payments over £95,000 must seek ministerial views. Section 7.5 of the Code is clear. Views must be obtained in any particularly high-profile cases, and I have to say the exit of CalMac is a particularly high-profile case. So, in light of what the Cabinet Secretary has just said, can I ask, therefore, at what point did the Cabinet Secretary know that this payment had been made? Was it after the payment had been made? One presumes so. At any point up until that, did anyone in the government or the civil service receive a business case for the severance package? And if so, who signed it off?
Cabinet Secretary.
So a number of points in there. In terms of the notice, ministers were given information that there would be a settlement. Obviously, it's up to CalMac Board to make decisions about employment positions. The officials, therefore, did sign off the business case. There was a business case. He sets out what is in the Finance Manual well. That is exactly the process. But, of course, and I might also add that the then Director of the Ferries Directorate in Transport of Scotland did write to CalMac to say that if there was anything in excess of £95,000 that they would require a new business case. That was alerted to them. Clearly what's happened in this process is that the accrued holiday pay of some £12,000, just over, that should have triggered the different process as is set out. Now, as I've indicated, we do take this seriously, and the Permanent Secretary is going to undertake to look further into the circumstances as to why this additional £12,000 on accrued holiday pay hadn't been added to the original amount and therefore triggered what would have been a requirement for ministerial approval.
Jamie Green.
I'm still none the wiser as to whether the Cabinet Secretary knew about the scale of the payment that would be made and when that information was made available to Government. The Cabinet Secretary has just stated that the Government were told that there would be a payment, so that presumably means that they were told in advance of the payment being made, but it sounds like they were given the wrong information about the value of the payment that would be made. The total value thus taking them over the limit in which ministers would have had to have intervened to authorise it. The whole thing is entirely unacceptable, and I think just chucking CalMac under the bus is not the answer here, because this is symptomatic of a repeated series of events where high-profile heads of public agencies have departed with very substantial golden goodbyes, of which the government failed to follow due process in signing off these payments. This is yet another example of that. Can I therefore ask if the Government will open up an internal inquiry immediately to get to the bottom of how these endless and repeated breakdowns in the process are happening, and will the government get a grip of these severance payments once and for all?
Cabinet Secretary.
So can I make it clear that in terms of what would be seen as the settled agreement, payment in lieu of notice, the compensation for loss of office, which would be identified as settlement, legal fees and, as I said, the holiday pay accrual. I don't think it's satisfactory if the procedures aren't followed, and I do accept that the Permanent Secretary, in undertaking further into circumstances, I'm sure will want to indicate how the process is dealt with by, for example, public corporations such as CalMac.
Katie Clark.
My member's bill on freedom of information includes a provision that public bodies proactively publish information. The Information Commissioner has ruled that CalMac breached freedom of information rules by withholding information relating to severance payments, and that there is a legitimate public interest in knowing how much senior executives in public bodies are paid on exit. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the aims of my Freedom of Information Bill that would require bodies like CalMac to proactively publish such information as severance payments for senior executives?
Cabinet Secretary.
So clearly, any situation that involves employment legislation, and she'll know from her professional background, has to be treated carefully in relation to the employment law as applied in any individual case. I would point out, however, that the information, and the reason it probably has come to light, is if you look at the annual report and accounts of CalMac, the compensation for loss of office is identified along with salary and along with employers' pensions contribution. So actually the information she's seeking is actually publicly available.
Edward Mountain.
And I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her early answers. I'm slightly confused here. Robbie Drummond worked for 3 days in that year and seems to have been paid £35,000 for each day he worked. Seems to be high by even anyone's standard. So can we just have a definitive answer, Cabinet Secretary? Did you agree it or did you not agree it? And do you think £35,000 a day is appropriate? Simple questions.
Always through the chair, please.
Sorry.
Cabinet Secretary.
So simply, it is for the board of CalMac to make those decisions, which they did. In terms of employment contracts, he will know that different people will, in different employments will have different severances. And in terms of understanding that there would be a situation where there would be a severance payment, that did not come to ministers for approval because it wasn't required at that time, because at that point the level was at £95,000. With the accruement of holiday pay, that's what took it over £12,000 more than that, and that's what should have come to me, and that's what I am not satisfied with, and is why I think that the examination of this is quite appropriate by the Permanent Secretary.
Order Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is not the first severance package being paid to a Chief Executive of CalMac, and that's all due to the SNP's government's mismanagement of our ferries. Meanwhile, the only people not being compensated for the ferry fiasco are the islanders, who are suffering as a consequence. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary when they will be paid compensation and when a permanent compensation package will be put in place?
It's somewhat wide of the substantive question. Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, it is, but I'll try and address it if I can. So across the transport modes, we are not paying compensation for disruptions. We've seen, for example, on the recent trunk roads, etc. However, she will know that this government is very cognizant of the business resilience issues within our islands, and that is why Mary Goujian, as the Rural and Islands Affairs Cabinet Secretary, has provided £4.4 million for business resilience to different islands that have been affected and impacted, and indeed that was recently expanded to include, for example, Isla, Jura, Mull and indeed other islands.
Question number 2, Paul O'Kane.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports of a postcode lottery for classroom supplies, and that some schools have only 93 pence per week per child for basic classroom supplies. Cabinet
Secretary Jenny Gilruth.
This Government has increased funding for education. The Education and Skills Resource budget rose in 25-26 by £165 million to over £3.2 billion. Local government also received a record £15 billion in 25-26, with an increase of over £1 billion to support on education and other local services. Scotland has the highest spend per pupil in the United Kingdom at £10,100 per pupil, approximately 20% higher than spending per pupil in other parts of the United Kingdom. And it is essential that funding protected by this government centrally gets to the chalk face in our classrooms where it will make the biggest difference. That is why I recently appointed John Wilson, a respected former head teacher, to lead work nationally which will interrogate issues pertaining to governance and school funding.
Paul O'Kane.
The analysis of FOI data from local authorities reported at the weekend showed that 6 of the 8 lowest spending councils rank among the areas with the most deprived neighbourhoods, with some schools spending less than £1 per child per week on classroom supplies. And in response to these findings, a Scottish Government spokesperson, we heard a lot of this echoed by the Cabinet Secretary in her answer, pointed to the funding, particularly funding through the Scottish Attainment Challenge, including pupil equity funding, which is supposed to go directly to schools in the most deprived communities to support children affected by poverty. So, isn't it clear that year upon year of reductions and cuts to council budgets is leading councils to have to make decisions like this, and actually the money that's meant to be additional, that's meant to add to our anti-poverty strategies and closing that attainment gap, is not getting to where it needs to go? I noticed she mentioned John Wilson, but doesn't the Cabinet Secretary recognise her own responsibility in this? And what confidence does she have that funds given by her government to tackle inequality are being used effectively? And what analysis has she done of that?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr O'Kane for his question. There were a number of different points in there, Presiding Officer. I will try to come to, mindful of time. He is absolutely correct to say that PEF funding should be additional in relation to school budgets, and that's the way in which it has been protected by this government through budgetary processes. And of course, I observe the Scottish Labour Party were unable to support the previous budget. But in terms of the FOI data itself, as I understand it, we do not have FOI data from all local authorities on this issue. And I think it's also important to note that the article in question that Mr O'Kane cited noted that the data can be recorded differently from council to council, and most of the figures, as we understand it, relate to 24-25 financial year. Of course, these figures were obtained by a tabloid newspaper. However, to the substantive point that Mr O'Kane makes, it is important we have an understanding at central government level of how this additionality is being used and in relation to school supplies. That's why I've asked officials and education analysts to give me a fuller update in that regard, because these measurements differ by local authority. But it is the case, Presiding Officer, that there has been an increase to the education budget, which of course Mr O'Kane and his colleagues were unable to support in last year's budget.
Paul O'Kane.
Thank you. I do find it extraordinary that in the final months of this Parliament we're just getting round to analysing exactly what is happening in terms of that spend in schools. And I find that shocking, but I actually think our teachers and our parents across Scotland will find that shocking as well, because this is a government who promised to close the poverty attainment gap a decade ago but have failed to deliver. A government that already presides over massive disparities in attendance rates, whilst we are still well below pre-COVID level, and has allowed violence and bad behaviour in our classrooms to go on the rise. And it's an SNP government that promised a Parliament of COVID recovery in education, and yet, in the Cabinet Secretary's own words, 5 years later, we've only just turned a corner. Scotland's once excellent schooling system has been undermined by the SNP over the last 2 decades, and this latest reporting is just the latest evidence for it. I mean, I hear the First Minister groaning. He had quite a lot to do with it from memory.
Question,
so can I ask
please,
the Cabinet
Mr.
Secretary,
O'Kane,
as a former teacher herself, does she think it is acceptable spending less than £1 per child per week on classroom supplies, and would that have effectively happened under her watch when she promised COVID recovery?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, like Mr O'Kane, I agree that governments should protect and enhance education spending. That is why, in last year's Scottish Government budget, this SNP government did exactly that, with a resource increase of over 3%. We provided extra money to councils for more teacher numbers, we provided extra money to councils for additional support needs, and we provided a record settlement to local government. Now, Scottish Labour's response to that record increase for the education portfolio was to sit on their hands. Now, this year, we hear from Mr O'Kane's boss, Anna Sarwar, that Scottish Labour are not in a strong negotiating position over the budget. In a Parliament of minorities, Presiding Officer, these benches might have expected Scottish Labour were in a prime position to force the hand of this government. Instead, just like last year, they opt out. That is a dereliction of duty from the Scottish Labour Party, Presiding Officer. They are happy to opine over FOIs and press comment, but when it comes down to it, they can't even bring themselves to push the button to secure more investment for Scotland's schools.
Thank you. Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, we all know that it's crucial that Scotland's classrooms provide positive learning environments to support children and young people. How is the Scottish Government funding improving the pupil-teacher ratio and, in turn, learning environments, as well as to address the cost of the school day for children most impacted by poverty?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as I've set out, thanks to additional investment secured in last year's budget and the efforts of education authorities, the census data which published in December showed an increase in the number of teachers in our schools for the first time since 2022, which is to be welcomed. But it also showed an improvement in pupil-teacher ratios, and our continued investment in relation to the Scottish Attainment Challenge over the past decade is helping to drive improvements at local authority level and in our schools, as can be evidenced by the very welcome progress we saw in the ACIL data which published in December.